Want to welcome back to the program Chris Paulos with Levin Papantonio Rafferty and from Pensacola. Chris, welcome back. I think it's been a couple of years since we've spoken.
Yeah, I think it's probably been 2 or 3 years since you and I last sat down and talked about things. And it's good to be back. It's nice to see you again.
Well, it's nice to be back here with the covering this conference. One of the things that I've had conversations in the past with attorneys who were going after money that ended up funding terrorism, particularly oil companies, I think it was at the time. And this was, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, maybe more. I can't really remember. And you are starting to work on this in some fashion, but with banks.
That's right. Yeah, I've been handling cases against multinational banks for the last 6 years, involving allegations of money laundering for terrorist organizations and front companies that finance terrorist organizations.
All right, let's get into that, because when I hear that, one of the biggest examples, at least of something like tangentially, was it HBSC?
Yep, HSBC.
HSBC, where they were designing their teller windows in Mexico to the specifications of suitcases full of money. In other words, like whatever the standard, like mid-sized suitcase was, they changed their teller openings so that guys could come in and literally push the suitcase through the window, which to me suggests they were aware, at the very least, that there were sort of atypical sums of cash coming in. And that may have set off an alarm somewhere, but apparently it did not. They were obviously essentially laundering, right? I mean, that's what that is. So walk through it for us. Like, give us an idea of what laundering means in this context.
So banks obviously play a critical role in any business and the modern global economy, and you need to be able to make transactions both electronically and in cash and in large sums. Banks are going to be necessary for you to do that. Also, the differences in currency and the types of currency that certain businesses or that are used across in certain areas of the globe are going to require banks to facilitate transactions that will exchange that currency. So with money laundering, if you're running an illicit organization that's either acquiring large amounts of money or securing or amassing large amounts of money, you're going to need to have somebody within the financial system to assist your management of that and your hiding of that. And so with laundering, there's a few ways that you can launder money. Just basically, you can take money that was obtained through an illegal transaction or some illegal business, a crime, and give it the appearance of being legitimately acquired. Or you can actually take what's called clean money that maybe it was donated to a charity out of the benevolence of somebody, and take that clean money and give it to somebody for an illegal or criminal purpose. So there's two types of laundering just based on where the money's coming from and how the money is going to be used. That's at the most basic level of it.
It's almost two different directions, right?
It's basically, is the money obtained through illegal purposes or going to be used for illegal purposes? So there's a two-directional flow there that launderers can assist with.
And we always assume that there are safeguards or regulations for banks not to engage in this. I remember when Rush Limbaugh got busted for going around town in Florida, taking out $9,999 in cash from like 3 different bank accounts so he could go pay for his OxyContin habit.
That's what we call proof of intent.
And I think Elliot Spitzer that was also flagged, because the banks, when you take out $10,000 or more in cash, they send a flag up to, I guess, the IRS or Treasury. And they say, hey, just want you to know, suspicious activity. And if you get close enough that it looks like you're trying not to set off that flag, they set up a flag. What other regulations ostensibly exist to prevent both of those? Because that would be the latter, right? I'm taking good money, using it for illicit purposes. What do they have in terms of what other safeguards they have to both protect against that and the other direction?
Well, in the United States, there's a lot of statutes and regulations that require certain things of banks. The Bank Secrecy Act and other statutes essentially put banks in a frontline position to assist with the prevention of terrorism and crime, and it gives them the affirmative duty to report suspicious activities. So like you were talking about in terms of the $10,000 transaction, that's an automatic type of flag that is going to be sent to the appropriate regulatory body to be reviewed. But if you see somebody doing exactly what you described Rush Limbaugh is doing, that too is suspicious. And the banks have a duty to not only report suspicious activity, but to know their customers. They need to know who is the account holder, who's the beneficiary of the money in those accounts. And they have a pretty rigorous know your customer obligation. They can't just set up bank accounts for front companies and not do any due diligence into who they're providing a service for. What you just described in terms of HSBC and the teller windows in Mexico is what many of the banks that I have sued did, but in different ways. They created specific departments to handle what they consider to be high-risk customers or transactions in high-risk areas, which are known havens for money laundering and essentially illicit transactions. So
isn't just setting up a so-called high-risk division sort of like prima facie evidence of wrongdoing? Like, I mean, it's not conclusive, but it seems to me like high risk of what? That they're involved in illicit activity.
Exactly. And so,
and are those instances, is there more rigor coming to knowing these people? Like presumably, like I could see like, look, we're not going to paint everybody with a broad brush. There are certain countries or industries that are associated with crime. But it's unfair to say no to all those people on the blanket. But we could create a division where there's heightened scrutiny of these people, and we double our efforts at knowing what they're doing and investigating and making them validated and whatnot. Is that what happens?
Well, you would hope that's what the bank would be doing if they, let's face it, it's a global economy. And, there's hotspots of crime and terrorism and areas of the world where this type of activity flourishes. But in those areas, there's also a need for charitable organizations and NGOs and the Red Cross and Doctors Without Borders who are assisting the population and the people there that are not part of these criminal organizations or terrorist groups. So there needs to be, banking services and economic services in those areas. And so you would hope that banks would be doing an even more rigorous know your customer, due diligence, and even reporting to the regulatory agencies of transactions coming out of those areas. What we've found and what we are litigating in my cases is that banks would identify those high-risk areas or those high-risk customers, and rather than actually being more aggressive in their affirmative duty to help regulators prevent the financing of drug trafficking or terrorism, they would actually create divisions that would service those customers in a way that would allow them to circumvent counterterrorism financing sanctions and allow them to process transactions without being flagged and sent to regulatory for review. So what they were doing for terrorist organizations is actually getting they use a system called SWIFT, or these electronic transactions processing systems. They would help those customers remove data from the SWIFT messaging that would avoid them from being flagged as suspicious. So they would remove customer names. They would put spaces between letters and customers' names so that the automatic filtering systems within SWIFT wouldn't flag those as a transaction for somebody on a terrorist watch list. And so that's what they were doing. And they were charging those customers a premium to do that. So they were making more money to do this for bad people.
That seems like, I mean, it's just a criminal enterprise.
Absolutely. And now, having been involved in these cases for as long as I have, there are recidivist banks. There's banks that are worse than others in terms of doing this. You've probably seen a lot of news lately about Deutsche Bank or Danske Bank or Credit Suisse. There's just some banks that just find themselves routinely in hot water or paying off a criminal fine or a civil penalty to the bank regulators, or being flagged for this type of conduct over and over and over again. And to me, it's just appalling that nobody's gone to jail, and that our regulatory system just allows them to pay it as a cost of doing business and to go on to the next kind of scam.
I mean, I can't help but think of like all of the sort of fraud that was associated with the mortgage crisis, and the both in the servicing of mortgages and in the loaning of mortgages. I mean, they're called loan officers because there's a fiduciary responsibility they have to do their due diligence, and stuff like we saw at Wells Fargo, where they're literally putting clients into other products without telling them. I mean, this is like, it's like George Santos level of like criminality, but there's always this veneer around banks that is like almost like a legacy of like, these are the most straight-laced. These are the most sort of like
too big to fail, and they're so important. And if you question their methods or what they're doing, and there's always the specter of a global economic collapse, and the trade and the market will implode if you clamp down on banks too hard. But the fact is yes, they do play an incredibly important role, and they're 100% necessary to the way that we've structured our economic systems. But they have been given pretty much a free pass, or at least just a slap on the wrist when they've fueled some of the worst humanitarian crises on our planet, or given money to perhaps the most evil people who exist in the world today.
Give me an example of who some of your clients, I mean, do you have clients who you're representing in this way?
In the cases that I'm handling right now against banks, my clients are U.S. nationals, primarily U.S. service members from Iraq and Afghanistan, Gold Star families who lost sons and daughters in those wars, and we have sued banks who have admitted to conspiring with Iran to circumvent counterterrorism financing sanctions that were in place to prevent Iran from being able to finance groups like Hezbollah and Al Qaeda, who we know were using Iranian support, including money, to attack and kill Americans in both Iraq and Afghanistan.
Why is there no is there governmental enforcement? Because what you're suing them is a violation of U.S. law that was meant to inhibit the ability of bad actors, those deemed by the United States to be bad actors, from getting money. Is there criminal enforcement, and what you do runs parallel to that?
Yeah. So when a moment ago I said these banks have admitted to this conspiracy, and that admission came through their agreement to enter into consent orders and decrees, or corporate integrity agreements with bank regulators like the New York Department of Financial Services or the U.S. Treasury Department. They have signed these agreements that they negotiated that basically means they cannot deny the fact that they entered and were part of this conspiracy, and they paid penalties to the U.S. government for some of this activity. One would hope that they would stop doing the activity that got them in trouble in the first place, but what we've seen is that they've just continued to do this type of business in different ways, and using other banking environments outside of the United States that might be less likely to be reported. So some of the more recent activity we've seen is in the Middle East.
Do you bring cases based upon the actions that they have already admitted to? In other words, this is a civil action as opposed to the sort of quasi-criminal or civil complaints that the government may have brought. You bring more that are more directly to compensating the victims downstream from what they've done in terms of that money, because there's a reason why those sanctions exist, and you're dealing with the implications of those reasons on the sort of where the rubber meets the road. Are you bringing them on those things so that you go into court and it's like, it's already admitted, now we're just arguing about how much damage they've done?
So I wish it was that easy, but yeah. So the documents that I'm talking about and the agreements, the penalties and fines cover a time period of where they were processing these types of transactions for entities that were supporting these terrorist organizations between about 2001 and 2012. So yeah, the government investigated them and negotiated them to a point where they were signing these consent decrees, entering into these consent decrees and corporate compliance methods at a time that they were processing these transactions that fueled a lot of the violence in Iraq and Afghanistan. Absolutely. So, but since we filed these cases, they continue to get in trouble for processing. Either there's been some currency exchange networks that these banks have handled in the Middle East, where Iran has been able to basically spread money across various terrorist groups using banks in Iraq and currency exchange networks. Also banks in the Netherlands and in Europe who are doing transactions for the National Iranian Oil Company, and which is essentially the ATM machine for Iranian-sponsored terrorists. It's the generator of money. We're going back to our money laundering discussion. Money that's generated through legitimate and legal oil sales that Iran is allowed to do because it's one of their number one exports. That's money that's apparently legitimate that then is being laundered for use for a criminal or terroristic purpose.
And when they sign those consent decrees or whatever it is, they don't get civil liability immunity, right?
No, they're not immune from lawsuits like ours from victims of terrorism that we can connect to these banks' transactions on behalf of the groups or the state sponsor of those groups, Iran.
Has there been any fall off from this type of activity as you've you've been in it for now 5 or 6 years and increasingly more deeper into it?
Yes.
What's the trajectory?
I think the trajectory is our regulators are always playing catch up, right? So they only find out about things later. Financing sanctions, counterterrorism sanctions, you hear a lot about these days, the sanctions on Russian entities with the Ukraine war. That's all kind of after the fact. So they have to gather the information. They have to put a package together that's like a probable cause package, if not even more detailed than that, and then determine whether or not somebody should be appropriately sanctioned. And that's all based on past conduct. By the time our regulators have put that together and put these sanctions in place, the criminals, the bad guys, and people within the banks who are very in tune with this have probably devised another way to do the same thing. So it's kind of a cat and mouse game, but the regulators and sadly attorneys like me are always trying to play catch up with the new methods that bad guys are using. And of course, now with cryptocurrency and online transactions and other means of transacting money digitally, criminals and terrorists now have more than ever before at their fingertips the ability to take good money and use it for bad purposes or clean their bad money.
If there are people who are trying to be part of the class that you're representing, is it exclusively military personnel?
At this point, the cases that I'm predominantly handling are not exclusive to U.S. personnel, but U.S. nationals that are victims of terror in Iraq and Afghanistan or other places. I handle cases for victims of terror in the United States, including the attack at NAS Pensacola on December 6, 2019, where that attack was committed by an officer in the Royal Saudi Air Force. I would love to be out of a job, meaning there is no more terrorism in the world and people that need my help. But the fact is that over the last 20 years, the terrorism incidents across the globe have exponentially increased. The extremism across the globe has exponentially increased. A lot of that facilitated by the internet and the ability for people to access the darker corners of the web, which contain a lot of violent and extremist ideas.
Chris Paulos, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Sam. It's good to see you.
Good to see you as well.